have with us Charis Kubrin, who is a professor of criminology, law, society, and sociology at the University of California, Irvine. She is an expert and a scholar on immigration and crime and the nexus between the two across neighborhoods and cities, and that's what she's going to be talking about with us today. She's won several awards, including the Young Scholar Award from the American Society of Criminology, and she is a fellow of the American Society of Criminology. Charis, welcome.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to thank you for inviting me to share some of the work I've done over the last decade and a half on the relationship between immigration and crime. It's been a research agenda of mine that's been incredibly fruitful and rewarding, but also extremely frustrating, as I will highlight in my talk today. And to get a sense of where I'm at now in terms of this research, I need to go back to the beginning, so that's where I'm going to start off today. So it's in the early 2000s. I'm an assistant professor of sociology at George Washington University, living in DC. I think it's a weekend day, Sunday, and I'm in my pajamas reading newspapers online. And I come across a New York Times op-ed written by a famous criminologist, a guy by the name of Rob Samson. And I see the title of his op-ed, "Open Doors Don't Invite Criminals." And that title just really intrigued me, so I started reading. And basically what Samson argued in this op-ed is that criminologists had been getting it wrong in terms of their explanation for the crime drop in the US. And so I'm not sure if you're familiar, probably many of you are, but starting in the 90s through about the mid-2000s, crime across cities in the United States declined. And the typical arguments that criminologists had been giving for the crime drop, the strong economy of the 90s, better police-community relations, incarceration rates, et cetera, he said all of those explanations were fine, but that criminologists had been leaving out a potentially important factor that may help explain the diminishing crime rates. And he said that this omitted factor was something that criminologists, as well as the public, had overlooked lightly because of an inherent bias. And I remember thinking to myself, well, what's he talking about here? And it turns out he was talking about immigration. Samson's argument in this op-ed was that crime declined in cities across the United States during this time period precisely because immigration to cities in the United States increased. And he based his arguments on findings from a survey that he had conducted in Chicago, where he found that foreign-born individuals reported lower crime and victimization rates compared to their native-born peers, but more importantly, regardless of whether you were foreign-born or native-born, if you lived in a community with high concentrations of immigrants, you reported the lowest crime and victimization rates. And these were findings he had published in the American Journal of Public Health. Now, to supplement his Chicago findings, he also had this nice little figure here, which had national data on homicide trends alongside immigration. So you can see immigration going up and homicide going down, suggestive of this relationship between increased immigration and declining crime. Well, I thought this was fascinating. I was really curious and wanted to see the paper that he was talking about. So I happened to be online, as I said, reading newspapers, got on my emailed him and said, "Fantastic op-ed, can you send me a copy of the paper?" Now, he must have been online because I got an immediate response back from him saying, "Yep, here's the paper, and by the way, thank you, because yours is the only nice email I've received all morning long." And I was naive at the time. You all know exactly what I'm talking about here. But brand new assistant professor naive was like, what's he talking about? So I asked him, and then he started forwarding all of the emails, the hate mails that he had been receiving all morning long, including this one. "Dear Professor Samson, I met your article with not merely a chuckle, but guffaws, uncontrollable hysterical laughter. On what planet did you study sociology? Buck Rogers' Mongo? I have never read a collection of convoluted statistics and fabricated claptrap such as you espouse, not in my 65 years, that even began to approach the level of absurdity you puff. I don't know from where you get your alleged facts, but I lived with your precious Mexican Americans in Phoenix, Arizona. I regularly witnessed drunken brawls, defecation in public streets, destruction of public property, violent fights with knives, guns, and machetes, assaults on innocents, a level of burglary and theft never before seen, until Mexicans moved into the area. 6 or 8 decades ago, before criminal indigent Mexicans began to fill our cities and towns, immigrants were studious, energetic, eager to assimilate, and peaceful. They contributed to this nation. Today's immigrants, however, especially Mexicans, are generally lazy, criminal, have no intention of assimilating, are uneducated beyond perhaps mid-grade school, have no trade, and are here for what they can suck from the lifeblood of our country. You and your Ivy League educated ilk live in a counterfeit utopian sphere of fantasy and lunacy. Your hot air would fill all of the balloons at the New Mexico Balloon Fest, leaving enough to launch the next space shuttle. Okay, wow. This email infuriated me. I remember reading it and just being like my blood was boiling. All of them did. They were all along these kinds of lines. I was blown away by not only the skepticism around Samson's findings, but also just the sheer nastiness of the comments. I mean, this was work being done by a leading criminologist. He was the president of the American Society of Criminology, which you're all attending here soon. He was the chair of the sociology department at Harvard University, one of the most highly cited and respected scholars. The data were speaking for themselves. It just seemed like nobody wanted to listen. And this became even more problematic when I started reviewing the research literature on what we know about immigration and crime. So admittedly, that was not a line of research of mine. I knew nothing about this topic. But when I was able to get online and start doing a literature search very easily, I found numerous studies, including ones dating all the way back to the 1930s, showing that foreign-born individuals reported lower crime rates than their native-born peers. In fact, a review published by the National Institute of Justice concluded the major finding of a century of research on immigration and crime is that immigrants nearly always exhibit lower crime rates than native groups. Now, despite this fact, public perception was just the opposite. And my investigation revealed it wasn't just those folks that were responding to Samson's op-ed. Research on public opinion, very quickly I was able to find, revealed that regardless of time period, so forget decade, but century, as well as immigrant group under consideration, public perception is always that immigration and crime go hand in hand. And I remember thinking, this was 2006 now, I thought, well, certainly in 2006 today in our multicultural society, this is not the case, at least on a national level. But just to be sure, I decided to access what's called the General Social Survey. It's a national survey that asks people their perceptions and thoughts on a variety of social and political issues. And it turns out that that year they had a question that asks, does more immigrants cause higher crime rates? And when I did a very simple cross-tabulation of the data to determine what percentage believed this to be true, I found 25% said this was very likely, and another 47% said this was somewhat likely, resulting in nearly 2/3 of respondents believing that immigration and crime go hand in hand. So, the results of this little investigation that I did in my pajamas on a Sunday morning completely fired me up, and I got really concerned about how off public perception was with respect to what we think is going on with immigration and crime. And then I started wondering, I wonder if this faulty perception is responsible for policies at the time that were being promulgated, restrictive, harsh, exclusionary policies aimed at immigrants, such as Arizona's SB 1070. Not sure if you're familiar with that, but basically SB 1070 criminalized undocumented status by encouraging police officers to identify people who they thought might be undocumented and ask them to see their papers. That was later deemed unconstitutional, but policies like this were becoming quite common at the time. I decided right then and there I wanted to get involved in this research. I wanted to do research on this topic to produce important findings that I could then share with the world to narrow the gap between what we know and what we think we know. And I began to see myself as an advocate, and not an advocate in the traditional sense of the word, but more an advocate for the use of policy to the use of evidence to inform policy, in this case, immigration policy. So, like any good academic, I devised a plan. And the first step of my plan was that I wanted to do research that addressed some of the limitations of Samson's argument. So he got a lot of crazy mail like that. However, he did get some critiques of his work, one of them being, well, you did this study for Chicago. How do we know your findings would replicate beyond the city of Chicago in other places that have very different immigration profiles or histories? And the second thing was that Samson had that nice figure showing immigration trends juxtaposed with homicide trends, suggestive of the fact that immigration could be responsible for the crime drop, but that's certainly not definitive. I'm sure you've heard academics say more than once, correlation does not equal causation. So I decided to identify some scholars already doing great work in this area. We got together to do studies to address these limitations. And the first study that we did, The Power of Place, Immigrant Communities, and Adolescent Violence, addressed the first question about the generalizability of Samson's findings beyond Chicago. What we found was absolutely yes. His findings were generalizable beyond the city of Chicago. We used a national data set called Adolescent Health Survey, AdHealth, and we examined the extent to which immigrant concentration in a community reduces impact violence. And what was the big finding? Main finding of the study is that immigrant concentration in a community reduces adolescent violence. Youths that reside in neighborhoods with large numbers of foreign-born and non-English speaking residents report fewer acts of violence, and this is controlling on a range of important factors that correlate with crime. The second study that I immediately published was titled Exploring the Connection Between Immigration and Violent Crime Rates in U.S. Cities 1980 to 2000. And here my colleague and I collected data over time to determine whether, in fact, immigration was in part responsible for the crime drop. Basically, what we did is we examined how changes in immigration were related with changes in crime across 159 cities in the US. And what we found was, first, unlike the long-held popular view that immigration is a major factor contributing to higher crime rates, our results suggest the opposite. On average, cities that experienced increases in immigration then had declines in crime. Now, since these two studies, I've gone on to publish like over a dozen studies on the immigration-crime relationship. And I tell you that because what's astonishing to me is the consistency of findings across the study. I mean, I may be the only speaker today in this whole conference that says there is such consistency in findings around a topic. It is really rare in the social sciences to have the same finding over and over, but that's essentially what my work and the work of others have shown. More immigration either has no impact on crime or reduces crime. Now, if you don't want to hang your hat on one person's research, you just need to look at the growing body of scholarship on the immigration crime link that really proliferated I'd say in the early 2000s and continues today. Now, several years ago, I was asked to come to Washington, D.C., this is now after I moved to UC Irvine, to present the findings of a report I had prepared for the National Academies of Sciences on what is known about the immigration-crime relationship. Basically, I was sitting in my office one day, phone rings, it's the National Academies of Sciences. And it's one of those kind of crazy phone calls like, why are you calling me? And they said, we are convening a panel here that's focusing on the integration of immigrants into American society. One component of that focuses on crime. We would like for you to prepare a report that reviews every single study that's ever been published on this topic. And I said, okay, because you just do what the National Academies wants you to do. And then you say thank you. And I spent the summer, 3-4 months, literally reading, including that 1930s article that I mentioned, every single paper that had ever been written on the immigration-crime relationship. I prepared a report and went to DC to share my findings. What was the conclusion of this 75-page report that I prepared? This: the consistency with which studies find that areas with greater concentrations of immigrants have lower rates of crime is simply stunning. This finding, according to the collective literature, holds true for various measures of immigrant concentration, as well as for different types of crime, in cross-sectional as well as longitudinal analyses of the immigration-crime nexus. And that panel ended up incorporating the findings of my report, along with many other reports prepared by many other scholars, into this wonderful piece of literature. You can't tell from this, but it's about this thick. It is really the most comprehensive analysis and assessment of how immigrants incorporating into America have affected a variety of outcomes, everything from crime to education, the workforce, religion, marriage, you name it. It's a great resource for those that are interested in reporting on this issue. So a couple weeks after that experience, I remember I was at the ASC, and I forget where it was that year. I'm sure somewhere very cold, like it is every year. Southern California to Chicago, it's been a rude awakening for me. So, and I was at the bar at the end of a long day of panels, having a beer with a colleague of mine, in fact, Graham Owsey, one of the folks I had done one of the earlier studies with. And I think I was telling him about this report and all the work I had done, and I'm sure I was had a beer or two, so I was kind of bragging a little bit, like, oh, I did this report and it's so thorough and I feel very confident about my findings. And I remember Graham, who's great at doing this, kind of put me in check, and he says, okay, well, yeah, that's a nice narrative assessment of the literature, but do you think it would hold up under increased scrutiny? And I'm like, what do you mean, would it hold up? And he said, you know, if you did a more systematic quantitative analysis of the literature, would you arrive at the same finding? And here he was hinting at a meta-analysis, which I'm sure many of you are familiar, which is a sort of a quantitative assessment of the studies that are done. And I got very defensive about that and said, of course it's gonna hold up. I did a good job, I worked very hard, and then I said, and let's do it, and I will show you. And then I woke up the next morning going like, oh, what did I just agree to do? Because meta-analyses are extremely time-consuming and a lot of work. But we initiated the long process of identifying, collecting, reading, and coding every single article that had ever been published on the immigration-crime relationship over a 20-year period that we identified, 1994 to 2014. Turned out there was over 50 of these studies that produced a collective 550 findings that we were analyzing. And we coded each study at least on 100 different variables. So we were saying, how is immigration measures? What crimes are they examining? What control variables are they including? What analytical approach? What level of aggregation? What journal was this published in? How many authors? I mean, you name it, we coded for it. This took years. And we did that to answer two really simple but I think important questions. The first was, across this body of scholarship, what is the average, overall average, immigration-crime relationship? Is it a positive one or negative? Is it strong or weak? And secondly, we wanted to know, if there is variation across these studies and the findings, what explains that variation? What characteristics of studies help us understand why some studies find one thing and other studies find another? And we collected all the data, coded it, ran the analyses, and this is what we found. First, across this entire body of findings, on average, the immigration-crime relationship is null. In other words, there is no relationship between immigration and crime. Immigration happens, it has no impact on crime one way or another. However, in studies that did find a significant relationship, they found it was 2.5 times more likely to be negative, immigration goes up, crime goes down, than positive. We also found that studies that reported the most strong negative immigration-crime relationship were actually the best conducted studies. What do I mean by that? I mean that they had longitudinal data that allowed them to do an analysis that teased out causality, very important, but also they tended to have more control variables. So what we found was that if you really focus on a subset of articles that are like the highest quality analyses, they tended to show a negative immigration-crime relationship. Now, the findings from this meta-analysis were published in the inaugural issue of a new journal at the time titled The Annual Review of Criminology, which at the time happened to be edited by none other than Rob Samson, the guy who wrote the op-ed. So it came full circle that way after a long bout of research in this area. Now, for many people, including the letter writer that I shared with you, it is simply unfathomable that immigrants could be less crime-prone than their native-born counterparts and that immigration could cause crime to go down rather than up. But it actually turns out that social scientists have pretty good theory for explaining these findings. So, for example, One thing we know is immigrants are not a random cross-section of a population from any given country, right? They are a self-selected group that comes to the United States often for the reason of doing better in life, right? They want to work hard, achieve, right? It's not easy to pack up your life, move to another country, find a job, settle yourself. The typical immigrant that comes here, therefore, is not wanting to break the law and get caught and forego all of the hard work that they invested in. So this is a selection effect that may be operating in part here. Also, by the way, highly motivated individuals that are seeking better lives, that are working hard and delaying gratification, that's not your typical characteristic of an average criminal, okay? It's also the case that high rates of unemployment among immigrants helps reduce poverty, which is one of the correlates of street crime. So for example, immigrants, and Ramiro Martinez has done great work in this area, they have quite high rates of labor force participation. Now, many will argue that labor force participation is low-wage labor, which doesn't pay a lot, but it does help offset poverty, as I mentioned. And then finally, immigrants have, on average, lower rates of what we call family disruption as criminologists. This is things like divorce and single-parent households. Family disruption is also can be a correlate to crime, and so on average, this helps with reducing their crime rates. Now, you may be wondering about the distinction between documented and undocumented immigrants. You know, does that matter? Is it, because often I've presented these things and people go, well, but why I'm talking about undocumented immigrants engaging in crime? Well, it's very difficult to examine that question because our crime data, as you probably know, Uniform Crime Report data, publicly official data, does not capture whether a person is foreign-born or native-born, let alone whether they are documented or undocumented. And then on top of it, it's very difficult to estimate the size of the undocumented immigrant population in any locale. However, a very recent publication in our field's leading journal, Criminology, by Michael Light and Time Miller, did their best to estimate these sorts of things, to figure out what the relationship might be between undocumented immigration and crime. So they calculated 3 different measures, estimates of the undocumented population across states in the United States over a nearly 20-year period to examine what impact it had on violent crime. And their big finding, again, drum roll please, was that there was no impact of undocumented immigration on crime across states in the United States. So, I mean, I could go on and on to talk about the research literature in this area. There's so much to go, but I want to move to the second part of my plan, my plan to save the world of wrongful information on immigration and crime. I'm saying that with a chuckle because, yeah, you can imagine where that's gone. Now, so evidence in hand. I thought, what do I do with all this evidence? Well, one thing I wanted to do was I wanted to get it to our young people. And in this case, that meant UCI undergraduate students. And so I developed and created a course, the first of its kind at UCI, that focused on sort of immigrant criminality, immigration and crime law and victimization. And this course, as I said, was the first of its kind. Turns out we have a very large student body at UC Irvine themselves who are immigrants or are the children of immigrants. They flocked to the course. They were absolutely interested in it. And so I've gotten to teach it almost every quarter at UCI. Now, the course does a variety of things, but one of the things I tried to do is, among my course goals, things like, you know, get the students to develop critical thinking skills, was I wanted to teach the students to become smart consumers of news reports, political rhetoric, and public discussion on what we know about immigration and crime. But the course was about so much more than immigration and crime. We looked at immigrants as victims. Imagine that, thinking about immigrants as potentially victims rather than just offenders. I studied the perception of the criminal justice system among immigrants, human rights issues, you name it. We covered all of this in the class. And I try and teach this class as much as possible, and it's been great because the students really appreciate learning about this issue. Now, my plan did not stop there. For step 3 of my plan, I decided I wanted to redirect my research focus. So basically, I, after that meta-analysis, had fully convinced myself that we did not need yet another study on immigration and crime. In fact, the jury was out on that, and it was time to move on. And I thought where I needed to move on was exactly to immigration policy. The fact that policies were being implemented that were restrictive, harsh, and exclusionary towards immigrants simply because of the perception that immigration and crime go hand in hand got me really worried. So I decided I wanted to redirect my research focus to examine the impact of immigration policies on immigrants, immigrant families, and immigrant communities. Now, what am I talking about when I say policies have gotten harsher, more restrictive, and exclusionary? Well, you may or may not be aware, it's become harder than ever to obtain U.S. citizenship through proper legal channels. When I give public talks about this, there's always someone in the audience that says, I don't mind immigrants being here, but they have to go through the proper legal channels. I mean, I could make a bet that someone's going to ask me that when I give this talk publicly. And I always explain to them, and I often have a slide to do it because nobody believes me, how actually difficult and challenging it is to do that. On average, it takes 10 to 12 years for an individual. It is extremely expensive, making that option prohibitive for many, many people. We also know that deportations of immigrants are the highest in U.S. history. They're the highest now, but they were highest even in recent past, including under the Obama administration. In fact, when Obama was president, we were called the deportation nation, and he was called the deporter-in-chief. So this is both a left and a right issue in terms of deportations in this country. We also have seen a steep rise in laws that criminalize immigrant status. So historically, being undocumented in this country meant that you had committed a civil violation. What we have done with laws like SB 1070 and copycat laws in Georgia, the Carolinas, Alabama, and so on, is that we have made it a crime to be undocumented. Now, there's a lot of pushback to those laws, but these are proliferating around the United States. And there's been a continued effort to make local police officers police immigrants in new and different ways. So, for example, also historically, when we were upholding the laws, the federal immigration laws that existed in our country, that was done by federal officers. Local officers were not involved in policing immigration, and it was for a good reason. Because you can imagine being a victim of a crime. You can be an immigrant yourself, documented. Why would you go to your local police officer and report that victimization or be a witness in a crime if you are worried is this La Migra or is this a regular police officer? However, over time, in what's called the devolution of immigration enforcement, we have asked our local police officers to get more involved in policing immigrants. And that's been through things like 287G agreements, the Secure Communities Program, Criminal Alien Program, and so on and so forth. And then finally, of course, there are Trump's executive orders, many of which we are still feeling the effects of today. So all of these policies got me wondering, what is the impact on immigrants and immigrant communities and families, these harsh policies? I decided to identify folks already doing great work in this area. By the way, that's my ticket to success. Find people that are already doing what you're interested in doing and doing it great, and then join their group. And that includes folks like Marjorie Zatz, Ramiro Martinez. We got together, we applied for funding from the National Science Foundation, and we got funding to hold a 2-day workshop at Arizona State University where we brought together scholars from a variety of backgrounds, anthropology, economics, political science, sociology, criminology, where they presented their original research on these themes, had a very fruitful 2 days, and from that workshop, we published an edited volume called Punishing Immigrants, Policy, Politics, and Justice. And in punishing immigrants, we sought to do a couple of things. First, we wanted to uncover and identify the unanticipated and hidden consequences of immigration policies and practices here and abroad. So we wanted to understand not the direct costs of these policies, rather their indirect or collateral consequences. So for example, when you deport so many individuals, what happens to family members that get left behind, spouses and children? What are the consequences, both short-term and long-term, of these policy decisions? Secondly, we wanted to illuminate the layered realities of immigrants' lives and describe the varying complexities surrounding immigration, crime law, and victimization. And here I was critiquing my own work in many ways, which had focused on the foreign-born population as if it was this monolith, completely denying the diversity that exists among immigrants on everything from motive for coming to the United States, racial and ethnic background, socioeconomic status, culture, and so on and so forth. In a number of the chapters in this book, we tried to examine that nuance. And then finally, we situated these themes within the larger context of immigration and social control, particularly new modes of control in a post-9/11 era. We were very interested in understanding how harsh, restrictive, and exclusionary immigration policy was co-occurring with anti-terrorism policy at the time following 9/11. The parallels are stunning, as you can imagine. Now, I think it was maybe a day, was it even, a day after this edited volume came out, I got an email with the subject line, California, immigration makes California stronger, nonsense. Oh, and by the way, I didn't get a Dear Professor Kubrin, like Samson at least got a Dear Professor Samson, I just got a you and your research team. I try not to take that personally. You and your research team reach the conclusions you wish to reach, not based on evidence or findings, but based on your radical left-wing politics. To pretend that there are no costs of policing our Mexican border, delivering the babies of illegal immigrants, educating them, incarcerating illegals who commit a disproportionately high number of crimes, bolded because, thank you for understanding the frustration, is the height of honesty, the height of it. But then again, you educators are the ones who have long clamored for more money for education under the false pretense that it will make things better. In fact, what you have done is dumb down education to such an extent that tens of millions of kids now attend college who are not qualified to do so. You should all be ashamed of yourselves for your dishonesty, but you are not. Especially the line about the connection between immigration and crime, because that cannot be any clearer. And I get this email and I reflect, like, why does this negative perception on immigration and crime persist despite all of the evidence to the contrary? I'm sure you all have thoughts on this. And we can talk about it during Q&A, but one thing we can agree on is there's still a lot more work that needs to be done, which is why I recently applied for and got funding from the National Institute of Justice for their solicitation on immigration and crime, New Directions. And in this proposal, we argue that despite significant advances in work in this area, there are still some limitations that remain. Specifically, understanding the particularities of the immigration-crime relationship is important. And as I mentioned before, this research, a lot of my research in particular, lumps immigrants together and neglects important within-group differences along these dimensions that are extremely important to take into account. And so our goal in this grant, which we recently got funded, is to actually begin to do analysis that addresses some of these dimensions. And it allows us to ask a series of questions, everything from how robust is the immigration-crime relationship, how do you capture the varied effects of groups on neighborhood crime rates, how does citizenship status matter? There's been a few studies including the Michael Light study that I mentioned here, but we certainly do not have definitive findings there, and so on and so forth. So that's the first thing we're trying to achieve with our new funding from the National Institute of Justice. Secondly, there's very little understanding of how the broader context, including where immigrants settle as well as immigration-related policies and practices, how they condition the immigration-crime relationship. So does the immigration-crime relationship look different in a community or in a city that has a long-standing history of immigration versus one that is newly admitting immigrants? So focusing on destination context as well as immigration enforcement. You may or may not be familiar, but my state, California, a couple years ago became a sanctuary state. And that means that the state as a whole, not just cities within the state, but the state as a whole, is refusing to have local police work with federal immigration authorities to do their job, precisely because of the drawbacks that I explained with that. Now, what does the immigration-crime relationship look like in a place like California versus another city that not only is not sanctuary, but has 287G agreements where local police literally walk around asking people to see their papers, right? We can imagine that that is going to vary quite substantially. So we're going to address a number of important findings and questions related to this particular thing. So that is being undertaken at the moment. I will have findings hopefully within the next year or two that address all of these questions. I want to close by just 2 more slides, one on implications and one on what does all this mean for researcher or scholar media relations, if you will. The big takeaway from today, I hope you get, beyond just that immigration and crime are not related, is that little is to be gained in terms of crime control by enacting harsh, restrictive, and exclusion immigration policy. If we are worried about crime and we want to get crime rates lower in this country, the last thing we should be doing is enacting harsh and restrictive policies aimed at immigrants. The value added of that is quite low. And I'm not the only one who believes that. A recent book published by famous criminologist Mike Gottfredson, Travis Hershey, they asked the question in their book, is punishing immigrants or creating policy directed at immigrants the way to go to lower crime rates? And they said, immigrants to the United States appear to have similar or lower rates of crime as those of citizens, an established finding for legal immigrants, and the most plausible hypothesis for illegal immigrants. It is thus not legitimate to blame the street crime problem on immigration and to suggest that major reductions in crime in the United States will follow from any proposed changes to immigration policies. So what then should we be focusing on if we want to lower crime? Well, I'm sure you've heard lots, and you will continue to hear lots of proposed solutions. I sort of want one important point to emphasize here. I'm not going to get specific, but we can't just focus on the punishment end of the spectrum. We need to look at the front end of our system, which is on prevention. And what do I mean by prevention? Well, there's lots of different things that we could focus on prevention, but certainly alleviating sort of economic disadvantage, the strains of poverty and unemployment would go a long, long way. That's not an easy thing to do, but it's what the data demand. And then let me just say a few words here. I'll close and we'll open it up for questions about barriers that I've experienced speaking to the media, and it's on both ends in terms of reporting on this issue and topic. I'm hoping some of you are interested and will do stories on this topic in the future. One of the biggest challenges I've experienced is what I call warring timelines. I'm sure you know exactly what I'm referring to here. Basically, the timelines that we're operating on are quite different. I have gotten calls from journalists who are interested in a study that I'm doing that I tell them about related to SB 54, which is California becoming a sanctuary state. And they said, oh, I want to report on this because a number of other states are interested. What are your findings? Well, my paper is sitting in the queue to be reviewed by academics. It takes them months, and then the journal will, if I'm lucky, get a revise and resubmit, and I'll spend months revising the paper. I mean, I don't need to tell you all this, you know this, right? And by then, we're talking a year or two later, I can finally sit down with the journalist and say, here is my published research. It's been vetted. And, they've moved on like 25,000 times to different topics. I have had and been in the situation where I've contacted journal editors and said, there is so much interest in this topic, a policy, for example. And I was here 2 years ago and spoke on criminal justice reform, and it was the same issue in California. We're voting on things. There's pushback on reforms or that sort of thing. What does your research say about it? And I've called up begging journals to let me be able to speak about something. Absolutely not, or you have to wait. And that's really problematic and unfortunate as far as I'm concerned. And by the way, these are for journals that have the word policy in their title. So like one journal I published in, and it's a great journal, don't get me wrong, it's a journal of the American Society of Criminology called Criminology and Public Policy. They might be a little bit faster, but not much. One issue that I've struggled with personally is I'm a detailed, nuanced person that likes to go into the robustness tests that I do and the regression findings and how these findings differ if you look at this crime or this variable or that variable. Let me get into the meta-analytic techniques that I did. No. Reporters are not interested in that. And I get it, because that is not appealing to readers. And so it's been a real struggle for me to figure out how to present findings in a way that is of interest to your readers and listeners and that sort of thing. We are not trained to do this. And so we need help, and I'm not sure where we get that help, but I've just kind of muddled my way through it, and it's been very, very challenging. And then finally, what I call the academic dilemma. We want nothing more than our work to make a difference, and unfortunately, we have no training in how to do that, how to get your work out beyond an academic journal that very few people are going to read, to translate it in a way that makes it of interest to the general population. The institutional mindset of universities is this is not a good use of your time. You need to publish in peer-reviewed journals, preferably the highest quality ones that have zero access to people outside of the university. So we're not exactly getting rewarded for that sort of thing. So there's little to no incentive in the academic structure for the media coverage of your findings. And that's something I work for a lot, but it's still a barrier that exists. So I will stop there and hopefully open it up for questions.
My first question, well, I have like two questions. The first one is, did you have, difficulties tracking, Black immigrants, particularly like Afro-Latinos, those coming from the Caribbean, and including them in this work?
So that goes to our current project that is attempting to sort of get into the nuance and diversity that exists among immigrants. In order to get data to examine specific groups like that, we need to use census data that is what's called restrictive. And we have on UCI's campus an RDC, a restricted data center, that's affiliated with the census. And in there, you're allowed to go access the sensitive data, if you will, because in some cases, we're looking at neighborhoods. If there's 5, folks that fit that bill in that neighborhood, you could potentially know who they are. So it's all very sensitive and restricted, and I get that. Unfortunately, we got funded from NIJ, and then the RDC shut down because of the pandemic. So we have yet to get inside the RDC to collect the sensitive data to do the analyses that would focus on specific groups, but that is changing now that things are easing up. So I hope to be able to examine those kinds of questions about specific groups.
And, where do you think that this connection between criminality and immigrant, groups come from? Do you think it's like this otherness that has accompanied like all groups, like whether it's Italian immigrants,
Yes.
And others?
So one of the best things that students get out of my class is we spend the first 3, maybe 4 weeks going over the history of immigration policy in this country. And one of the things you cannot leave those discussions with is how problematic things have been historically. So this is not a recent phenomenon. Trump didn't create this. This is something that goes back literally hundreds of years. And I go through that history very systematically with the students. What they learn, if it's not the Irish, it's the Polish. If it's not the Polish, it's the Chinese. If it's not the, and we go through all of the different groups, all of the different policies historically. Then we talk about what the common underlying factor is, right? If it's not a group and their culture, and if it's not a particular time point in history, what is it? And I work on them to arrive at the conclusion that it's everything from racism to xenophobia to, right, so on and so forth. So that's an absolute important component of what is going on here, but it's not everything, but that is the backdrop upon which all of this rests, I think.
Hi, Joseph with the Arizona Republic. So first off, thank you. This is amazing. I was yelling at my editor right now. I'm like, why the fuck haven't we not been reporting on this more? So we'll probably be talking soon.
Lots to say.
Well, especially immigrant kid from living in Arizona, I appreciate all the research. So one thing that actually you probably know quite well about is the John Lott study that came out of Arizona in the Department of Corrections, showing a direct line between immigration and a high use and a high increase of crime. Now, obviously, that's been debunked.
Yes.
But I guess my question is, the Republic, we reported on that kind of irresponsibly, and it took a while for that kind of information to get debunked, even going up to Cato to have to say, like, hey, this is not right. How, as reporters, can we be skeptical of these kind of really complicated studies?
Yeah.
And also, how can we also replicate it within our newsrooms? Some of us are part of I teams that have the abilities to do that. How do we replicate and how do we scrutinize these?
That's such an important question, and I know exactly the study you're talking about, and when that study came out, my phone was ringing off the hook, only because reporters had read some of my work and they wanted me to weigh in. So one of the things I feel as an academic is it's my responsibility to respond to these phone calls. I'm busy, as everybody is, but I need to sit down and speak with a reporter to explain why that study is problematic, which many of us did in the field. First of all, it's very rare that a study like that gets published, simply because that's not what the data show, right? At some point, you can twist the data. Let me back up, because I don't like to use that word because it undermines everybody's research. You can go hunting for a finding. And you can obfuscate to make a finding appear and then be suggestive about it. And, but then where does that fit into the larger profile of what we know about the research? So I think good investigation would reveal there are a number of folks who have done work in this area whose findings are contradictory, speaking to them about it, but it's also our responsibility as academics to take those calls and spend the time to explain why we think that study is problematic. And luckily, a lot of people did, and that's why that study quickly faded from, now, at least it faded in my world. I don't know if it's got a lot of traction and what it's doing now, but it really was very quickly responded to. I got recently asked to review a report by the National Institute of Justice. They had solicited 2 scholars to do an overview of the immigration crime work. They asked me to be a reviewer. There were problems with this. And I sat down and I spent, I don't know, months going through this 100-page report around concerns about some of the characterization of the findings. So it takes time, it's a lot of time and energy, but like that's what we have to do. So that's my advice there.
Hi, I'm a reporter with the Associated Press in Texas, and I help cover immigration in Texas. So first of all, thank you. You've given me a lot to look into. But my question is regarding the data specifically on some of these trends. A lot of the policies that have been recently created in Texas are specifically on these narratives of a relationship between crime and immigration.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of the time when we report on this, we don't step away too much from the template of just this is what this politician said and this is what an advocate said. Right. So how can we go deeper into that and look into the data to prove kind of what these trends are actually showing?
Yeah, so I mean the first thing is, I mean often there are incidents or what I call anecdotal evidence, like N of 1 stories that capture the imagination of people. No matter how many studies we throw against that, it's almost impossible to neutralize. However, providing that bigger, broader context is absolutely fundamental in my mind. So if there is going to be reporting on an individual case, that is accompanied by context and background and reminders that this may be an aberrant case. To give you a concrete example, this has sometimes worked. I've had reporters call me. There was a case locally of a undocumented individual that was driving, so undocumented, but we don't know anything else, that was driving in their car and they hit somebody and hurt them or even killed them. And, you know, and so they want to hear my thoughts about that. And I said, well, how many times are you reporting on native-born individuals getting in their car, drunk or not, or whatever the situation is, and killing somebody? What is unique about this story that you're not covering? And often there's no answer to that. Like, what's interesting is that the person's an immigrant and undocumented. And so I've said, well, why do you even need to report on that? So the other question I've had, so I've actually had reporters go, yeah, actually I may, or if they do report on it, They report the broader context so that this N of one incident that's going to reinforce stereotypes that people have about immigrants is not at least going to be neutralized a bit. So that's at least a couple of things, but it's really hard to do that because I don't have to tell you all how impactful stories are, right? And how not impactful data can be to folks. So I like to tell the reporters, you know, it's great if you do individual stories about immigrants that have been successful and stayed out of crime, despite all the odds that they had to face. That's a story, that's an N of one story. And I say the same thing about criminal justice. Like we tend to focus on people that are incarcerated that get out, go on to commit crimes. We hear about those folks left, right, and center. What do we not hear about? All of the incarcerated individuals that leave prison, re-enter their communities, and lead successful lives. So we need to have N of one stories on all sides of the spectrum.
I'm Kaylee Johnson with the Fort Worth Star-Telegram in Texas. I also really appreciate this talk. And my question kind of actually, you answered basically the end of that answer, but I just wanted to ask anyway, I guess, is, so a lot of times, our coverage can be kind of, we're basically responding to something negative going on, and then we can provide that greater context of, this politician said this something terrible, but it's not factually accurate. But yeah, how in our daily coverage can we instead take the proactive approach of pushing back on this faulty public perception surrounding immigration and crime?
I have a question for you all with respect to that, which is, how do you treat, if I provide evidence in the form of journal articles from myself and my colleagues, and you speak to an individual who will say the opposite, are these treated equally? Okay, yeah, I mean, I don't know, because sometimes I feel that they have been. It's like, here's one side and here's the other side, but I'll go, well, wait a minute though, one side, this side, and I'm not saying I know everything and then I'm right about everything, but this is like not just my opinion. This isn't, I don't have a, dog in the race on this. This is what the evidence says. And yet this person comes in and they will say one statement, and it's almost as if they're presented sort of on this side we've got this and on this side we've got that. And so I've always wondered, like, what are the rules around that in journalism, and how often something like that happens?
Well, I'll speak personally that I feel like this both sides isms were something that were kind of always, were kind of implemented in this false notion of being objective in a lot of newsrooms, and I feel like at least that's being pushed back on and questioned a lot more recently, in the past 5 years or so, of we don't need to, like when you're reporting on climate change, you don't need to have one person saying it exists and one person saying it doesn't, because one of those is factually accurate.
Yeah.
So at least I feel like it's at least come a long way, but that is something that has occurred, and we are still, that was very wrong, and I feel like journalism did a lot of bad in that sense.
It's interesting you should say that. My husband's also a professor at UC Irvine in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, and he got invited onto a show where he was going to be arguing with a flat earther, basically. Okay, and the show is called like Middle Ground or something. And my husband said, no, I refuse to go on to this show. There is no other side, right? And so we laugh at stuff like that because it's so preposterous. But climate change, that's still happening. He teaches a course called Physics of Energy in the Environment. And he doesn't even ask the question, is climate change real? He tells the students, we're beyond that. And so I feel like, when I go into this class and I teach there's facts that we have, and, ours are social facts. So there's more, it's a little bit different than like gravity, it's not every single time is that going to happen. But our social facts matter, and they have weight. And they have weight in a way that I feel often is discounted when a quip that someone says is matched up with that in the effort to get both sides of a story. So if there's other evidence, that's one thing. That's something that I've noticed and I think would be important to address.
Hi, I'm Emily with the Santa Rosa Press Democrat up in the North Bay. I have two quick questions, or one quick question and then one deeper question. The first clarifying one, does the research suggest that immigrants are also less likely to be the victims of crimes, or does it only speak to alleged perpetration?
No, it turns out their victimization rates are higher than their representation in the population. That varies by a lot of things. So for example, what we know is the context of reception really matters. So I sort of mentioned that we're studying like sanctuary states and cities. What we find is that rates of victimization are much lower in places where immigrants feel safe to report victimization or speak to the police about issues and problems. Also, offenders or would-be offenders know that immigrants are not now deterred from going to local police and will report so they don't essentially target them. What we find is places that have 287G agreements, places that have the local police policing immigration, have higher rates of victimization among immigrants, largely because people realize that immigrants are afraid to go speak to the police for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So, boy, that makes a great target, right? Knowing someone is not going to feel comfortable, even if they're documented. They may have a family member that's undocumented. They may worry about their status being confused in a database. I always tell my students, you think these databases are perfect? I said, you are students at the University of California, Irvine. Show of hands, how many of you had like administrative nightmares because of UCI databases, and all the hands go up, right? There's errors in those. So even if you have not done anything, you've been victimized, you're documented, you're still less likely. So that's kind of an important finding, I think, and in many ways, that's why California passed SB 54 and why the state as a whole became a sanctuary state, for that very reason.
Thank you. And we've also been talking a lot about this rise in violent crime we've seen in 2020.
Yes.
I'm wondering if you have any thoughts or hypotheses about whether changes in immigration has anything to do with that. I know the research is probably not published yet.
Having not done the analysis, I will not definitively conclude, but I can speculate that immigrants had nothing to do with that. And in fact, it might have been higher had fewer immigrants been in this country, actually, if we go by what the data have said. Now, again, we always have to be testing. New data is coming out, new conditions are happening, so on and so forth. But if the past is any indication of the present and the future, I think that answer is quite clear.
Hi, I'm Maya King with Politico. Thanks for doing this. I wanted to drill down on a point that you made about post 9/11 and attitudes kind of towards immigrants, and how that gave rise to more restrictive and kind of crackdowns on immigrant policy. And I was wondering if you've seen kind of just how attitudes towards criminality, I guess, in immigrant communities might have changed as a result of 9/11. I was just wondering if you could talk more about, just what you found as before and after, because I know that was kind of a huge shift in both policy and public opinion.
Right, so I just mentioned historically this is nothing new. However, post 9/11, we really see a huge uptick in xenophobia, in policies that are restrictive and harsh. We see a reorganization of the Justice Department, right, the Department of Homeland Security now. We see budgetary shifts that are very important. Follow the money. That's always something that's very fascinating to look at what percentage of budget goes towards immigration enforcement. That just skyrocketed at that time. Right, so yeah, it's been absolutely on many, many dimensions, shifts and changes. And, having President Trump in with the executive orders absolutely doubled down on a lot of those efforts. While Obama was president, even though he was deporting at quite a high rate, something that I said, again, is sort of the left and right issue, he was undoing a lot of the policies around devolution of immigration enforcement. He got rid of, I wrote a paper in Criminology and Public Policy called 7 Reasons to Abandon the Secure Communities Program. And there was a lot of research being published at the time that showed that it was not only helping public safety as hypothesized, this is where police were getting involved in policing immigration. It was doing harm, much more harm. And I'm happy to talk about that study more, but what we found was a few years later, not because of that research, but in spite of it, President Obama started shutting down secure communities, funding to 287G programs went down, we were shifting in the right direction, in my mind. Well, when Trump became president, all of that got resurrected and continues today. So, you know, there's these ups and downs, however, post 9/11 was really the beginning of the modern shift, and researchers identify this period, of the modern shift of extremely harsh and restrictive policies.
One quick follow-up. Do you think then that if there weren't more like restrictive policies post 9/11, that perhaps attitudes towards criminality in immigrant communities might have been different? That might be an obvious question.
Yeah, but the question is how might they have been different? Yeah. I mean, you know, I think about crime control as a pie, a zero-sum game. If we invest money, energy, resources into fighting crime here, we necessarily can't do it here. And so if we are spending all of our time and energy in cracking down on immigrants, what are we not doing? And that's true for any policy, of course. And so for me, it's just an absolute waste. It is an absolute waste to be doing these kinds of policies. I don't know how much money has been spent, right, between the wall and the detention centers. What I can tell you is that the one person or the one group that has profited off of all of this is the private industry, the private prison industry. When Donald Trump was elected president, their stock skyrocketed. Why? Because he was going to round up and deport millions of undocumented immigrants. Well, where are you going to house them while they're being processed? In private detention facilities that need to be built and staffed. So now we're spending all of this money to house individuals, right? Now you might say, well, they shouldn't have been here. They're undocumented. Go back, right? Okay, you can take that moral stance. The question is, are we actually helping public safety this way? Where could the money that we're investing in that be going to actually make a difference in crime?
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm a reporter based out of New York. Thank you very much for this. I am wondering if you're thinking about the climate crisis and climate migration in this work and how that's going to increasingly shape this discussion and add urgency to it. So how are you maybe thinking about it, and how as we as journalists can weave in the narrative of climate and its increasing role in migration and immigration?
Well, thank you for just giving me my next research agenda. Because to be honest, we don't like to admit this, but I haven't been. And actually, as you're sitting there saying, I'm going, absolutely, of course. First of all, I critique my own work because it's US focused. Now, it's US focused because you have to start somewhere, and there's plenty to focus on here. However, let's not pretend like what's going on in the US is indicative of anything going on anywhere. So I'm just now starting to look at what we know about immigration and crime and immigration policies in places like Europe and Australia and Canada. And by the way, newsflash, Australia and Canada look quite the same in terms of the immigration-crime relationship, what we know. Europe is a mixed bag, and that's really fascinating. And part of it has to do, we're like figuring out what is different about that context that may be producing these differential findings, right? So some studies that focus on countries like Germany or the Netherlands or France might find a positive relationship between immigration and crime, others find a negative. So it's more nuanced, and we're trying to understand that. Plenty of scholars in Europe also trying to understand that. But I have not yet even begun to think about your macro question. And I think it's a really, really important one, and I don't know anyone who's doing work in that area. So I can't even refer you to someone, but thank you for putting that on my radar screen.
I'm Rio. I work in Las Vegas, which is a very, very diverse city and community. And we've kind of touched on this already. I guess how can I help dispel some of these harmful myths about immigrants in my newsroom? To me, it's been an uphill battle personally in my own reporting, not playing into these storylines. I guess I wonder if I were to pass my phone over to you and my editor was on the phone, how you would explain this, or how I can explain this when it comes up again. Well, we need to get the other side. We need to background anyone who has a name that sounds like they may be an immigrant. These are kind of some of the challenges I'm facing. So.
Ooh, that's a tough one. I mean, beyond what I've been suggesting here. A lot of times, and I do this with my own work, is I step back and go, why am I even asking that question to begin with? Because that really sheds a lot of light. Like at some point I said, why do I keep studying immigration and crime and putting those two words together? Like, you know, and that was one of those things where I said, you have to stop putting those two words together in a sentence and in titles. And so that's something that I'm thinking about is how common those two words are connected. And, you know, and I say to myself, why do I keep studying this immigration-crime relationship? Why am I not moving on? So this has forced me, like I said, to look in new directions, even as I still think it's important that we examine these issues. But, yeah, study immigrants as victims. Maybe if you do a story about immigrants as criminals, what is it right to say a sister story? I don't even know what that's called. A parallel story about immigrants as victims. Or, in other words, are there other ways to write about immigrants in stories that are not always linked to crime and bad behavior? And what would those stories look like, and what do they focus on? And again, I say the same thing with incarcerated folks. Can we have a story in the news about individuals who were incarcerated or back out in the community that doesn't lead to, and here's the new crime that they commit? And making sure those stories get space too. Profiling, immigrants who have, again, really, it's astonishing. You would think, given all the barriers and obstacles they face, should be committing crime left and right in some ways, right? They're coming from another place. They're often of lower socioeconomic status. They don't speak the language. They're facing discrimination in the housing and employment markets. Life is tough. Why not do they turn to crime? That's a fascinating story to me, is how they're not doing that. It's the absence of the story on immigration and crime, if you will. So, yeah, that's one way I can think of. I don't know that solves the problem.
Hi, my name is Sanjana, right here. I'm with HuffPost. I first wanted to really appreciate the fact that the new research is addressing limitations on previous research. I think that's a really great thing to look at. Something I'm wondering if you're hoping to find out in that research, and please correct me if you've already found something like this, but I know that you're looking at the racial ethnic groups between immigration, is if you're hoping that the research will help dispel the model minority myth among Asian Americans. I also know that, that fuels the whole idea of a good immigrant versus a bad immigrant, and again, correct me if you've already found this, if the often dangerous perceptions of certain immigrants can sometimes come from other immigrants.
Exactly. Thank you for raising that point. So I do not do any work on the model minority myth. There's a lot of sociologists that do. If you email me, I can shoot you over their names and their work that speak directly to that. But yeah, in fact, let's be real about the public perception. It goes across races and ethnicities, across, it's immigration status, and so on and so forth. And that's often a shock to me, but then at the same time, we're all under this umbrella of context, if you will, getting messages. So that's something that is important to point out, and absolutely the case, that there have been, it's like an othering, right? And we do this all the time. We talk about the poor and the working poor. Like, why do we need the word working in front of the poor? Because we want to differentiate the lazy poor from the non-lazy poor, right? In that word. So I do think language is so important. As reporters and media folks, you know that. I don't need to tell you that. And so I do think it's important to be careful, like what words are we using? I do not use legal and illegal, personally. People still do, and that's a preference. And but there's a lot of, alien, for example, is still used. In fact, it was actually painful to me when I applied for the National Institute of Justice funding, that the title had the word alien in it. And I was like, I can't believe I'm applying for this with this word here. This is unbelievable. So paying attention to the wording, making those changes, I think is absolutely fundamental, but we still have a long way to go with that.
You said something I know I am a radio person. It's kind of embarrassing. You said something about the immigrants and crime rate during the pandemic, and you were sort of teasing something, and I just wanted to ask you what you meant by that.
Oh, I was simply saying, I think I was asked if what role sort of immigration plays in the rising recent crime rates. I'm assuming Professor Rick Rosenfeld, who I know quite well, was talking about concerns around homicide and some other crimes that have upticked.
Yeah.
And so the question was, how does immigration factor into this? Since we haven't examined that specifically, I cannot speak with definitiveness, but my guess is, based on what we know about the prior work, that immigration's played almost no role in those upticks.
Oh, I thought you said something about they helped it or something. Did you say something that they may have lowered the crime rate?
Oh, right. I'm saying, if anything, if I was a betting person,
Right.
I would bet that maybe perhaps rates could have been even higher had immigrants not been here. In other words, immigration might have helped keep lower what are rising homicide rates.
Because the numbers were higher coming into the country at that time.
Yeah, I mean,
Okay.
basically, but more immigrants increases your denominator.
Right, exactly,
Okay,
yeah.
So when we're talking about a crime rate, if you flood a place with a lot of people that don't commit crime, that numerator divided by that denominator gets much smaller. If immigrants weren't here, and we just had native born and that numerator, the rate could be higher.
Right.
Now, I don't know that.
Sure.
That is my,
I just wanted to, I kind of assumed, but I wanted to double check, so thank you.